Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. There are now more than 2 million Americans behind bars. How did that ever happen? Well, it's a story that was told 14 years ago in Marc book, Race to Incarcerate. Now, the Race to Incarcerate book has been reissued in graphic form, courtesy of graphic illustrator and artist Sabrina Jones of World War III Illustrated fame. Marc of the Sentencing Project and Sabrina are with me here in the studio. Thanks for coming in.
Good to be here.
Race to Incarcerate, 14 years on. Did you have to do a lot of updating, Marc?
Well, we had to do a little bit of updating. Some things are opening up these days. The political conversation is changing a little bit for the better from my perspective. I think there's a little more receptivity to looking at what works for public safety rather than what sounds tough in terms of producing public safety.
And Sabrina, this is called a graphic retelling. Is it, as Michelle Alexander of the New Jim Crow suggests in the introduction, about reaching younger audiences, or more than that?
I think that younger people will be a very strong audience for this book, but you don't have to be younger, as graphic novel fans exist in all ages, and many people, including myself, who found it hard to read Marc's very dense, statistically driven book, will find it much more appealing to pick up a graphic version of it.
Now, the graphics of the pure numbers are pretty chilling. Just remind us, Marc, for a second about the numbers incarcerated in this country and how it's
Well,
grown.
we've got more than 2 million Americans behind bars. That's 6 times as many as we had 40 years ago. The United States has now become the world leader in its rate of incarceration. If you compare us to other industrialized nations, we lock up our citizens at 5 to 8 times the rate of all those other nations, basically.
And how did this happen? I mean, I learned things in this book about the origins of incarceration that I had no idea of, courtesy in part of your graphics. Sabrina, what did you learn?
I think a lot of people will be surprised to learn that we can't take for granted that locking people up has always been a universal response to crime. That the idea of that being a punishment actually occurred in early American history. Before that, it was more corporal and payment and execution. So while locking people up, I discovered, and many will discover in this book, was considered a humane alternative to corporal punishment, public whippings, and other forms of torture and humiliation. It's now been carried to such an extreme that keeping people locked up for many years for relatively small crimes is just as heinous a crime in itself as cutting people's hands off. I regretfully admit that Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, where I do hail from, was the place where they experimented with this notion, which was well-intended, as many would admit, was intended to reform people through repentance, hence the name penitentiary. But there's a very thick line between voluntary and involuntary repentance. That all kind of went out of fashion sometime in the 80s, I'd say, when the tide shifted away from a rehabilitative model into a punitive model. And the policies that were most popular in the ballot box were get tough on crime. There was no longer any talk about how to help people change their lives and prevent crime or come back and return from a criminal life. And the passion was aroused in the voters on the issue of unforgiveness and toughness.
Even the British novelist Charles Dickens ends up coming in and seeing the Eastern State Penitentiary and deciding, even in the 1840s, I think, that clearly this psychological torture of isolation probably worse than any corporal punishment you could dream up.
Yeah. And what's remarkable is how little the model has changed really in 200 years. We still think that somehow putting people inside a cage and far too often doing very little to help them turn their lives around is somehow going to produce magical results. And what it does is just isolates them even further from their community, job opportunities, the social networks that people need to thrive on.
Now, the race part obviously has many meanings in the context of incarceration, but just talking about speed of incarceration for a second here, when did the growth of prisons really take off?
Well, this all starts back in the 1970s, and if we look at this enormous growth, by and large what we know is that this is not because we now have 6 times as much crime and therefore 6 times as many prisoners, but we've had changes in policies, what's come to be known as the Get Tough movement. And the Get Tough movement means we are going to send more people to prison and keep them there for longer periods of time, and that is our strategy for providing public safety. So it's policies like mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes and you're out, the war on drugs, all of which have been designed to put enormous numbers of people in prison, and political people in both parties for many years very much embrace these as good strategies, at least for getting themselves elected and producing good sound bites.
And some people seem like they had a personal mission they felt they were on. John Ashcroft, for example, George W.'s Attorney General, he got personally involved in death penalty issues.
Very much so. A number of states have repealed the death penalty or have never had it, and as head of the federal justice system, Ashcroft, sometimes was trying to override states that did not want to use the death penalty themselves, but when there was a federal case, would have it charged as a death case. And this was very much contrary to the will of the population in those states, but it seemed like he was making a strong political statement. We're not going to let that get in the way of things. We mean to act tough, and we're going to show how tough we can be.
Talk about women for a minute, Sabrina. You have a beautiful part of the book, an addition to the original, that talks about the case of Kimba Smith. For those who don't know who Kimba was or what Kimba is, tell us about that.
Yes, Kimba very much is still. I decided to expand the story of Kimba Smith in the book because her case so much exemplifies what has gone wrong in recent decades, because as women continue to be the most rapidly growing segment of the prison population, this follows the sentencing laws which incarcerate each person involved in the crime for the same amount of time, regardless of how tangential their role is. So Kimba Smith was the girlfriend of a drug dealer. She actually didn't do drugs or directly sell them herself at all. But the FBI was on the trail of her boyfriend, and when he was killed, they went and pinned all of the time on her. And because of these laws where they say if there's X amount of drugs, there's X amount of years, this young 24-year-old woman who was abused by her boyfriend, also very typical or very high proportion of female inmates, she wound up getting a sentence of 24 and a half years, longer than she had even been alive on the planet. Now, she was one of the few fortunate ones who came from a nice middle-class family, single parent, 2 parents, 1 child, and they promptly devoted themselves to a media campaign to try to save her, speaking to any kind of media or community group they could get to. And though their appeal that was led by the NAACP was denied in court because of those sentencing laws, her sentence was legal. But it got to the attention of Bill Clinton. So unlike most women in prison, she has a happy ending. After serving only 6 and change years of her sentence, Bill Clinton pardoned her on the last days of his presidency. So she is now a very active advocate for sentencing reform and teaching college girls how to avoid becoming a victim of abuse.
You're able, through the graphic presentation, to highlight contrasts and contradictions when you parallel, for example, middle-class white families and black families and the likely effect of a drug addiction problem. Also, the continuing debate around crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Where does that stand today?
Well, it's improved, but it's not equal at all. People still do much more time per amount of drugs for crack cocaine. It's 18 to 1 currently instead of 100 to 1. In spite of all of the science on it, that we've learned that crack really was not more dangerous, didn't turn you into a bigger monster than cocaine did. And crack is largely passing out of use now, but still we're stuck with this legacy, which is, it's a place where politicians are vulnerable, and this is a concern. Until we change public opinion, as we're trying to do with the book, politicians will be vulnerable when they try to reform the laws.
And that gets to the other word, the other meaning of the word race. You quote a former police chief, Bell, I think he is, who says, if America was incarcerating white Americans in the way that it incarcerates African Americans, would our, I think he says, common conscience change?
This would change very quickly, right.
Do you think it would?
Absolutely. I think there's no question, the crack cocaine law is the best example back in the 1980s. Did members of Congress sit around and say, how can we incarcerate more young black men and then black women? I don't think anybody said that very consciously, but the image of the crack problem was that of a young black male, basically. And I think that largely explains why in record time these laws were adopted. When it's people who look like us, people we care about, people we relate to, all of a sudden our horizons open up, and we can imagine a variety of ways of looking at some of these problems that involve prevention, treatment, and strengthening families and communities. When it's the other, when it's racial dynamics, then all of a sudden incarceration seems to be the simple answer that gets adopted in public policy.
Now, it seems as if the will of the voters maybe is changing a little. I think in your introduction even you suggest that there might be some brightness on the horizon. The elections of 2012 gave a lot of people hope.
It did. I think, if we look to the extent criminal justice issues were on the ballot, we now have 2 states that have legalized marijuana possession. The voters in California voted to scale back the state's notorious 3 strikes law, which had put people in prison for 25 to life, in one case for stealing 3 golf clubs from a sporting goods store, and the voters have said no, at the very least these need to be serious crimes. And we also see, even in Congress, we have some bipartisan support for reform. The crack cocaine sentencing laws dating back to the 1980s, which had huge racially discriminatory effects in 2010, were scaled back considerably and with overwhelming support from both Democrats and Republicans. So we're starting to see some change in the political environment.
Isn't it also true that crime is down?
Crime has been going down for a number of years, and so in many ways the issue is less emotional, less politicized. People are more worried about the economy now. And I think we're seeing examples now of states, New York, New Jersey in the lead, where we've seen substantial declines in their prison population and no adverse effects on public safety.
What's the record of the Barack Obama administration?
Yeah. Well, it's mixed. In some respects, I think they've been very supportive of reform, the crack cocaine sentencing reform. They're very out front on that, very supportive. Re-entry issues, helping people from prison come home and have services and transitional support and the like. The major failing from my point of view is that the war on drugs is still raging, even though there's more support now for treatment programs and prevention. The number of drug prosecutions, the number of people in prison for drug offense is still at record levels, and it's been very difficult to turn around those prosecutorial policies, even in this administration.
Kimba Smith today, you'd have less chance than ever to get clemency. Isn't he at the lowest level of clemency granters in recent history?
Yeah, well, this president is on record to become the stingiest president in history, basically, in terms of giving out pardons and commutations, and certainly not for lack of good cases that come before him that are very deserving of this.
So that goes back to something we were hearing from Eugene Jarecki when we interviewed him about his film on the drug war, which is that it's probably going to be at the local level.
I think we're seeing that already, certainly. I think the money's more real there. I think the public safety issues are more direct. I think there's more of an interest in trying to get it right, trying to be cost-effective, responsible, meeting demands of the public there. So I think we're seeing more things happening in encouraging ways.
Well, Race to Incarcerate, a graphic retelling, is just out from the New Press. Marc Mauer, Sabrina Jones, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.